today's Gail F. Beach Memorial Lecture. Our guest today is Dr. Ziva Cooper. Dr. Cooper is the director of the UCLA Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids, and she's a professor at the UCLA. And her research is focused on cannabis and cannabinoids. She has a lead project funded by the NIH and by the state of California. Dr. Cooper contributed to the comprehensive report on the health effect of cannabinoids and cannabis to the National Academy of Sciences. She is president-elect of the International Cannabinoid Research Society. She is also at the board of directors for the College on Problems on Drug Dependence, and she holds editorial position in several scientific journals, and I'm sure there is a lot more than this, but please welcome Dr. Cooper. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. It's really great to be here. I've only been here for a couple of hours, but I've already learned so much about what's happening here and have been totally blown away at the level of science and clinical impact that's going on, and the beautiful buildings and the synergies between preclinical and clinical research. It's been really inspiring. A disclaimer, I do not study spinal cord injury, but hopefully what I do is somewhat relevant to spinal cord injury. And in fact, I know that it is because I know that there's been some preclinical research and some clinical research happening now investigating cannabis and cannabinoids for pain associated with spinal cord injury. To give you just a brief sense of where I'm coming from, I started off as a preclinical psychopharmacology grad student, postdoctoral fellow, interested in substances that are abused, so psychoactive substances that have abuse liability. And then about 15 years ago, I moved over to do clinical research using double-blind, placebo-controlled procedures. Again, really focusing on abuse liability, addictive potential of substances, trying to look at different pharmacotherapies that might help with substance use disorders, trying to understand variables that reduce or also potentiate the addictive nature of drugs. And around that time, it was in 2007 that I moved over to doing clinical research. A lot of states were legalizing cannabis for medical purposes. And there really wasn't much evidence for the utility of cannabis and cannabinoids for the therapeutic indications for which they were being prescribed. But at the time, I was in a lab that was studying the negative effects of cannabis, something that, of course, you know, the NIH has been supporting for decades. And so I became really interested in understanding both the potential therapeutic effects as well as adverse effects. And because my background was really in pharmacology, I come at this from a kind of a basic pharmacological methodology perspective. So today, I'll be sharing studies with you that are phase 1 FDA-approved studies. So we use healthy participants to look at some of these cannabis constituents. The cannabis plant has hundreds of molecules in it. Many people think that some of these molecules can be therapeutic. And so what we do in our lab is we look at these individual chemicals as well as the chemicals put together and the cannabis plant as a whole. We compare them to placebo under controlled situations, again, in healthy participants. And we do it in healthy participants because a lot of these chemical constituents have not yet been tested in people. So before moving to a patient population to understand their therapeutic effects, especially for pain, understanding route of administration, what doses might be effective, time course, potential adverse effects such as intoxication, which is known to occur with cannabis, it's really important to do them in healthy participants. So with that, let's see if I can advance the slides here. No? Does that? Hang on. Okay. So clinical research, I've talked to some groups here. Where's Roberta? doing CBD studies. So this kind of gives you a sense of how difficult these studies are to do. I'm very grateful for the support that we've gotten to help support our research. I want to note that all the studies that I'll be presenting today, a lot of them are still continuing, and I'm going to be showing you some early data from these studies. They've had to be approved, of course, by the IRB. They've had to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration, sometimes several times over, because our drug supply has shifted from one company to another, if one closed down, if one restarted. They also have to be approved by the Drug Enforcement Administration. All of my studies involve Schedule I substances, so controlled substances. And California, even though it's probably the most progressive with respect to laws, legal laws, with cannabis and cannabinoids, California has a very special unit out of the Attorney General's office called the RAPC. It used to be called the CRAP, the California Research Advisory Panel, but they thought wiser since they were getting the stink eye from everybody. The RAPC reviews all studies, including preclinical studies that involve Schedule I and Schedule II substances, and they are really a determining factor of how quickly we can get these studies up and running. They actually closed down for 1.5 years last year, conveniently, for those of us who study these substances in the state of California. So these studies are quite arduous just from a regulatory perspective. The studies I'll be talking about today have been funded by the NIH, both by the NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse. Traditionally, National Institute on Drug Abuse is studying the abuse of these drugs, but we actually have some studies looking at the potential therapeutic effect of these drugs, cannabis, and as well as National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. So you might have seen this map several times. The colors are kind of funny here. Sorry about that. But we know that cannabis is legal in more than 50% of the United States. It's legal here. It's not yet legal for non-medical use, or is it legal for non-medical use here? No. Right, I guess it was on the ballot this past year. Right, nothing actually got approved on the ballot. Nebraska passed, but it's being held up. So right now, there are 38 states in the United States where you can get cannabis for medical purposes. 24 of those states you can get cannabis for medical and non-medical use, so like recreational use. And then an additional 9 states where you can get cannabis with low levels of THC. In addition to this, we have 50 countries globally that have legalized medical cannabis. Now, despite this fact, just remember that cannabis is federally illegal. It's Schedule I. When I'm talking about cannabis here, I'm talking about marijuana. Cannabis with more than 0.3% THC. Each state has different laws governing what you can get cannabis for, what medical indications, and also different laws regarding what types of products are available, how these products are taxed. And so we have a patchwork of crazy state-run regulatory processes that is kind of overseeing the quality control of these products and also the industry of these products. And California is booming. It is, I don't know if Florida is necessarily there yet, but you can imagine that in the state of California and in Los Angeles in particular, the number of different products that are available, the strength of the products that are available is really, it's booming. So there's a couple of industry trends that are coming together that is of public health concern. So one public health concern, of course, is the fact that cannabis itself, marijuana, when you go to dispensaries or when you get unregulated cannabis, we're starting to see that it's growing in strength. And we measure strength of cannabis as percent of delta-9 THC. And so you can see here, this is unregulated cannabis that was seized by the DEA. And from 1995 to 2014, you can see that the percent of THC in cannabis has increased. If you continue that out to 2017, it increased further. We know that this is not a trend only in the United States, but it's happening globally. And just as a reminder, these are unregulated, so people call this black market cannabis that's been seized. If you go to a regulated market, so in Los Angeles, and maybe in Florida too, I don't know how many of you have visited dispensaries here, but what you see in a regulated market, so in Los Angeles or Washington State here, is that the percent of THC far exceeds what you saw in those graphs before. Generally speaking, when you get flower or plant matter, you can't get below 20% THC, and frequently the plant matter will be much higher than 20%. And now there are these products that are high potency concentrates. Essentially, they're extracting the THC from the plant, and people are inhaling high concentrations of THC in a single inhalation. And you can see that in these extracts, you're getting up to 100% THC. So potency is increasing wildly. I think none of us would have seen this coming 10 or 20 years ago. We also know that people are using it in many different ways. People are smoking it, blunts, joints, that's old school, fine. But now we're seeing people are vaporizing it in different ways. People are using edibles in different ways, from medical preparations to different types of edibles. We know that there's a group of industry people that are capitalizing on other chemical constituents in the cannabis plant, so moving away just from THC, focusing on CBD. Why CBD? In part CBD because unlike THC, it is not intoxicating, it does not produce cognitive effects, and people think that it might be helpful for a range of indications. In fact, a while ago, there was CBD-infused athletic wear because people thought that it would help your muscle recovery after an intense workout. On Overstock.com, you could get a CBD-infused pillowcase that promised a restful night's sleep. You can get pills and tinctures and CBD-infused food. By the way, according to the FDA, all this is illegal. Okay, so even though hemp is legal across the United States and according to different states, according to the FDA, all of this is illegal. CBD is not a supplement. We also see the emergence of other phytocannabinoids. So CBD is a primary phytocannabinoid that we've seen a lot of. How many people here have seen these phytocannabinoids? CBD, CBG, CBN, CBC, those of you who are physicians. Okay, great. How many people here are physicians? How many people here see patients? Okay, those people who see patients or do clinical research, you frequently get questions from patients here about using cannabis or these other cannabinoids. Okay, so this is somewhat popular here as well. So we're seeing that in the United States, not just in California, that CBD has become a little passé, and now the industry is moving on to other phytocannabinoids such as CBG and CBN. CBN, people think that CBN is helpful for sleep. And you can get these other cannabinoids, you can get vape cartridges, you can get topicals, and we're also starting to see industry trends with respect to terpenes. Terpenes are chemicals in the cannabis plant that are not unique to the cannabis plant. Phytocannabinoids are unique to the cannabis plant. Terpenes are hydrocarbons that are in spices, herbs, fruits, vegetables, okay? So you can find these terpenes in really almost all organic material, but people think that they might also contribute to the therapeutic effects of cannabis. So we have these emerging markets, we have people using them, and the issue is that we have increased access. There's a public health urgency here related to the effects of these products. We know that there are risks associated with cannabis use. So these are just a couple of risks associated with cannabis use. Today, I'll be focusing on cannabis use disorder, or a proxy of cannabis use disorder, and the acute effects of cannabis, such as intoxication and impairment. So we know that people are using these drugs for therapeutic reasons, okay? We want to make sure that these products are safe, or at least the chemical constituents are safe to some degree. And the aspects that I look at with respect to safety or adverse effects are related to intoxication, impairment, which I won't really be talking about now, and abuse liability. Abuse liability is when you look at a drug and you determine if people like the drug and if they'd be willing to take it again. And generally speaking, psychoactive substances that people like and people are willing to take again, those are considered to have abuse liability and may lead to continued use and potentially a use disorder down the line. So we have these products, and the question is, how can we address the risk of using these products amidst increases in medical use? And so you've seen here, just with a few hands here, that people here in Florida, our patient populations are using these products. And there are risks associated with it, especially given that in states with medical cannabis laws, 30% of chronic pain patients report using cannabis. Chronic pain is the #1 reason why people are using cannabis. And when you look at the evidence, there's actually mixed findings. There isn't really strong evidence that cannabis is actually good for chronic pain. Of course, chronic pain is could be many different indications. But when you look at all the randomized controlled trials together and all the observational studies put together, there are mixed findings as to whether or not cannabis might be helpful. And there are also these adverse effects associated with cannabis. So today what I'm going to focus on is delving into different cannabis constituents that are popping up on the market and asking the question as to whether or not these cannabis constituents might be able to reduce the harms associated with cannabis, and these harms are really attributed to delta-9 THC, and if it's possible for them to improve outcomes. And I'll be talking about, I speak pretty loudly, and I don't think I need the microphone so much. Just let me know if you can't hear me. I'm used to walking around a little bit more. Today I'll be talking about certain phytocannabinoids and certain terpenes that are of interest. And this idea that these phytocannabinoids and terpenes might play a really important role in the therapeutic effects of this plant called cannabis. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the phytocannabinoids that we know a lot about. So we know delta-9 THC, I've already told you a little bit about. Delta-9 THC is the component in the plant that's responsible for the intoxicating effects of the plant. It's also responsible for the cognitive impairing effects of the plant. With respect to cannabis use disorder or dependence, physiological dependence, we know that delta-9 THC is the constituent in the plant that is responsible for those effects. Now, just like opioids and a lot of other therapeutics, even though there are adverse effects associated with delta-9 THC, there are therapeutic effects associated with delta-9 THC. And we know this from early on in the 1980s, when there were a series of studies done with synthetic delta-9 THC, which led to the FDA approval of delta-9 THC for improving appetite and reducing nausea in certain patient populations. We know there's also evidence, although again it's mixed, that delta-9 THC might be helpful for certain chronic pain conditions. If you look at the evidence from preclinical literature, the preclinical literature abounds with respect to the potential for delta-9 THC and its helpfulness for analgesic effects. When you look at population-based studies and you ask people about their experience using THC for pain, people report that it's helpful. When you look at randomized clinical trials of delta-9 THC in certain chronic pain patients, we see that there has been some success. And lastly, and relevant to this conversation, when you look at controlled laboratory studies, where you're comparing placebo to delta-9 THC under very controlled situations, we know that the effects of delta-9 THC, its pain-relieving effects, are both dose-dependent and route-dependent. However, it's not without adverse effects. And I'll show you a study that demonstrates this that we did more than 10 years ago at this point, where we were interested in understanding the pain-relieving effects of delta-9 THC at different routes of administration. And this was before the onslaught of edibles came about. Most people were still smoking cannabis. Most people still smoke cannabis, although edibles are catching up. And we were interested in understanding in a healthy population, can you get analgesic effects using a test called the cold pressor test, which I'll talk more about in a minute? Can you get the analgesic effects of delta-9 THC by the smoked route and by the oral route? And when would you expect to see the effects, at what dose, and how long do the effects last? And so you can see here, this was a 6-hour session, 8-hour session, and we gave people a capsule, and it had 20 milligrams of THC or placebo, and we had people smoke a cannabis cigarette that had 20 milligrams of THC or placebo. And what you can see here was percent threshold, pain threshold, so how long people were able to keep their hand in the ice cold water before reporting that it was painful. And when you extrapolate from their pre-drug administration latencies, under placebo situations, you didn't see any change over the course of the session. As expected, when people smoked cannabis with 20 milligrams of THC, you saw an immediate increase in how long they were able to keep their hand in the cold water before it was painful, and it rapidly decreased. This kind of follows the pharmacokinetics of smoked THC, smoked cannabis, where the THC hits the blood immediately and quickly leaves the blood. With oral THC, we found a slower onset of action, but it was a longer duration of action. Okay, and what this demonstrated to us is that in the laboratory with healthy participants, you can see the analgesic effects of this cannabinoid using the cold pressor test, which has predictive validity for analgesics used for chronic pain, and it can be dose dependent and route dependent. But when we ask participants to rate how high they felt, just on a scale of 0 to 100, what you can see is a separation. The separation is not just due to onset of action and duration of action, but what we found here is that in oral THC, we saw a reduced magnitude of intoxication relative to the smoked cannabis. The smoked cannabis produced reliable intoxication. It quickly came back down to baseline. So did the oral THC, but the magnitude of effect wasn't as high, wasn't as great. And we asked people how good of an effect they felt. So this is a measure of abuse liability that I'll be talking about throughout the presentation. And again, with smoked cannabis, we got greater ratings of feeling of good effect than oral THC. So this was an important study because what it demonstrated is that you can take the same molecule, you differ the route of administration, you can get analgesic effects, and you can get a time course, but there's a separation there with respect to the adverse effects. And if you think about it, up until about a year ago, I would have said if somebody was going to use cannabis for pain relief, using cannabis orally, you'll get less adverse effects than if you smoke it. For example, you'd get less intoxication, you'd get longer duration of analgesic effects, you get less abuse liability. And I would say that until about a year ago, because recently there was a study demonstrating that the number of emergency room visits attributed to cannabis are due to edibles, are due to these oral preparations, in part probably because people take a gummy or 2 gummies, they don't feel an effect, and then they'll take another 2, and then all of a sudden you are stuck being very uncomfortable for a long period of time. If somebody feels uncomfortable after smoking cannabis, feels paranoid, dizzy, nauseated, by the time they get to the emergency room, they don't feel it anymore. Oral preparations are long-lasting, and hopefully I convinced you of this. Yes, there's a question.
I was going to ask, how does that correlate with the brain exposure? So are you reaching higher peak exposure in the brain if you smoke it versus if you take it orally? And does that explain the difference in the sensation of intoxication?
That is a great question, and that's a good question. And we don't know if it's necessarily pharmacokinetic or a pharmacodynamic effect. Oral THC also, what's interesting is that when people take oral THC and you draw their blood, you barely see any THC in their plasma. The effects are mostly due to metabolite because it goes through first pass metabolism. So there's a complication there. So it's not just THC that we're looking at, even though I'm comparing them across the 2 routes. And please, I'm happy to answer questions throughout the presentation. It makes me feel better, actually. Thank you for that. Okay, so what this showed is that in the laboratory, we can use healthy participants and look at the analgesic effects of these cannabis constituents, and we can look at the onset of action, and we can look at adverse effects as well. And we can demonstrate that these effects are dependent on a variety of factors, specifically here, route and dose. In that paper, we looked at 2 different doses. I'm not showing that here. And we can test them in the human lab. Okay, so that's THC. Another cannabis component, of course, is cannabidiol. We already talked a little bit about this. And of course, it's gaining popularity, or it's already at its pinnacle of popularity, because when you take cannabidiol, you do not get intoxicated. It does not have abuse liability. If you take 1,500 milligrams a day for a long period of time, which is a very high dose, by the way, and then stop taking abruptly, there's no measurable or observed withdrawal effects, at least not that we've seen it. So people don't become dependent on cannabidiol. But we know that cannabidiol is used therapeutically. The FDA approved cannabidiol as an anti-seizure medication. People take cannabidiol for anxiety, for pain, although really for the other myriad indications for which people are using it, the jury is still out with respect to whether or not it's effective. And specifically for pain, which is our focus here, when you look at the preclinical evidence of cannabidiol's effects for pain relief, they're actually quite mixed. It kind of depends on the model. It seems like inflammatory sources of pain are more responsive to cannabidiol. When you look at survey studies, though, the people who respond to survey studies who are saying they use cannabidiol for pain, it's hard to find a negative survey there. When people are shelling out the money for cannabidiol and they're taking your survey, usually they're reporting that it is helpful. But the few randomized controlled studies that have been done with just cannabidiol, no cannabidiol plus THC mix, they just have not been convincing. Maybe 1 or 2 have shown an effect, but really cannabidiol on its own, we are still learning about it. So for example, with THC, there have been probably more than 50 or 60 randomized controlled trials at this point. With cannabidiol alone, probably 10 or less than 10 at this point. Most studies with cannabidiol, there's always some THC in that cannabidiol. And one would wonder what the THC effect is having in those studies. What about controlled laboratory studies? Does cannabidiol produce dose-dependent or route-dependent analgesic effects? And the truth is that we don't really know yet. Little is known about cannabidiol's effects clinically for pain, despite the fact that I think it was reported 1 in 7 US adults have reported using cannabidiol, and pain is the primary reason why people are using it. So people are using cannabidiol for pain. We don't really know if it's helpful. So this is a study where we looked at oral cannabidiol using the cold pressor test in a healthy population. And just to give you a frame of reference, when you go to the dispensaries and buy cannabidiol, usually you get a gummy for 5 milligrams or 10 milligrams. In this particular study, we were giving oral cannabidiol up to 800 milligrams, and we looked at pain tolerance. Again, that same measure we looked at before. And what we found is that up to 800 milligrams of cannabidiol in this healthy population, we did not see any effect of pain tolerance here with these very high doses. We looked at adverse effects as well, and guess what? Cannabidiol doesn't have adverse effects, at least with respect to these endpoints. So we did not see pain relief, but we also didn't see intoxication, and we did not see abuse liability. So in that respect, cannabidiol might be perceived as, being less risky. So if people are using cannabidiol and they feel like they're getting some relief from pain, well, we can be assured that at least they're not getting intoxicated, impairment, they're not getting cognitively impaired, and there's no abuse liability associated with it. A couple of other cannabis constituents of interest that I'll be talking about today are those terpenes, those hydrocarbons, and 2 terpenes that are of interest, one of which is being studied here, beta-caryophyllene, are myrcene and beta-caryophyllene. There aren't randomized controlled trials looking at the analgesic effects of these 2 terpenes. So we're doing the first studies in people, but when you look at animal models, and again, one study was done here, an animal model of spinal cord injury, beta-caryophyllene and myrcene produce a really interesting signal, suggesting that these 2 terpenes might be therapeutic for pain relief. And when you look at surveys, people report preferring cannabis types that are higher in concentration of these 2 terpenes. So beta-caryophyllene and myrcene are 2 of these terpenes, and there's this idea that they might interact with THC or with some of the other cannabinoids to have a positive synergy. When you look at all the terpenes in the cannabis plant, you can see that myrcene and beta-caryophyllene are the 2 most abundant terpenes. Pain patients choose cannabis types that are high in these 2 terpenes. In fact, in one particular study in patients with migraine, 1/3 of the patient population substituted those cannabis types for opioids. In animal models, beta-caryophyllene and myrcene have been shown to reduce nociceptive responses in different pain models. And what's interesting about these 2 terpenes is that even though THC might produce behavioral effects that demonstrate intoxication and abuse liability, at these 2, at the analgesic doses of these 2 terpenes, you don't see those effects, and they are not rewarding. So when you do typical tests in animals where you look at the rewarding effects of THC or other abuse substances, those are not exhibited with these 2 terpenes. And beta-caryophyllene, in fact, not only does it not have rewarding effects on its own, it's actually being investigated as an anti-addiction drug. It's thought to reduce misuse-related effects of drugs, alcohol, opioids, and cocaine. And so there's this thought that if you add beta-caryophyllene with THC, for example, you might be able to boost the pain-relieving effects and reduce some of the negative effects, such as the rewarding effects. And so the question is, do these constituents work together? So some people call this the entourage effect, where you have the whole plant and the constituents work together. And you can have an enhancement of the positive therapeutic effects and a reduction of the negative effects. And the question is, has this ever been shown before? People talk a lot about it. Has anybody heard about this entourage effect here? Just raise of hands if it's part of like the lexicon. Okay. So I don't necessarily like to use the term entourage. It's just an idea that these molecules work together. There's evidence of this for many other pharmacological classes of drugs where different drugs can work together to enhance the therapeutic index. So what is the evidence here? There's been some evidence that cannabidiol can reduce some of THC's negative effects, specifically related to THC's potential psychotic-like effects. So this is a study that was published in Neuropsychopharmacology in 2010. At this point, I think it's been cited over 900 times. Okay, and it was one of the first studies to demonstrate that when you give cannabidiol with THC, it might actually reduce the pro-psychotic-like effects of THC. And so people really ran with this idea. And many studies have been looking at the potential of CBD to be added to cannabis as a way to reduce the adverse effects of cannabis in like state supplies or in country supplies. So here's an example of a study that looked at what happens when you add cannabidiol to the cannabis plant. When you have higher levels of cannabidiol, does it reduce the harms? Okay, so there was, and I have a grant, admittedly, I have a grant that looks at this. Is it possible when you increase the cannabidiol, are you going to reduce the adverse effects? But most recently, about a year ago, a couple of really important papers came out. One paper from that same group that published in 2010 in Neuropsychopharmacology, looked at lots of different ratios of CBD and THC, and they found nothing. They looked at probably 50 outcomes, from plasma levels to cognitive outcomes, and they looked at higher levels of CBD to THC, and the whole paper, no findings. CBD did not have any effect. And in fact, a more recent paper looked at the effects of oral cannabidiol with THC and found in this JAMA Open Network found that when you add high doses of CBD to THC, you actually get higher THC plasma levels, suggesting that no, the more CBD you add to the THC, you might actually show worsened outcomes. So all this is to say is that up until very recently, there haven't been studies looking at the pain relieving effects. Are there an augmentation of the pain relieving effects of CBD with THC? And this is important because a lot of people are using these drugs for specifically pain. And so the question here today are, do these constituents, CBD and terpenes, can they decrease pain response on their own? So the terpenes we really don't know anything about. Cannabidiol we know very little about. Could they decrease pain response on their own? Is it possible that they might enhance THC-induced analgesia such that you need a lower dose of THC and therefore reduce THC's adverse effects? So I'm going to tell you about 3 different constituents. We're going to talk about cannabidiol, beta-caryophyllene, and myrcene, their effects on their own on pain, and how they interact with THC. All these studies are done in a very controlled environment. Participants come to our lab. They're very carefully screened to make sure that they're healthy and to make sure that before each session, they come in for many different sessions within subject placebo-controlled study. Before every session, we ensure that they haven't used any cannabis. They have to be cannabis users, people who use cannabis to improve safety. They're healthy people, and the doses that we choose, because a lot of these studies, it's the first time we're looking at these chemicals, the doses chosen for these studies are usually concentrations that are found generally in the cannabis plant, that people are generally exposed to. And this was an FDA thing. They made us really adhere to that. And the way we look at pain is we use this cold pressor test that I mentioned before. So we have people put their hand in warm water for 3 minutes to regulate their temperature of their skin, and then we have them put their hand in ice cold water, and we have them report pain threshold, latency to report pain, and pain tolerance, latency to withdraw the hand. And we use this assay specifically because, well, it's economical, it's easy to do, you can do it repeatedly in a session. So it's not like you only can look at pain response at one point during the course of the session. You can look at it 8 time points during the course of the session. And also it has predictive validity for other analgesics that are used for chronic pain. So even though we are using a healthy population, it could have predictive validity for analgesics used in the pain population. Another important point, of course, is that every person is their own control. Because it's a within subject design, and because we're looking at the drug effect in relation to their response before they get the drug, we can nicely control for any type of baseline pain that the participant is having, although this group does not have any pain, so we don't really have to worry about that. But people have different variations in pain. Some people can keep their hand in the ice cold water for 45 seconds. Other people can keep it only in for 5 seconds. We also ask people to report how painful the stimulus is. We ask them to report how painful it is, how bothersome it is. And we use a test called the MPQ, the McGill Pain Questionnaire, where we ask people to rate the different quality and sensations of the pain. So again, this has predictive validity, and also every person has their own control. When we look at the, yes?
So for the baseline assessment, how many times do you do that?
Baseline assessment is done every session before they get the drug. And then for every participant, we look at the post-drug administration in relation to their baseline of that day. And the truth is that people don't vary much with their baseline, unless they come in and they've had cannabis that morning. But we test for that.
How long between the baseline and like the first post measure?
It usually depends on the route of administration of the drug, but it's usually about 30 or 45 minutes. And then we look at, you can see the time points that we use. So we ask people to rate how intoxicated they feel on a 100 millimeter line. We ask people to rate positive drug effects that are indicative of abuse liability, good drug effect, how much you like it, would you be willing to take it again? So here we have cannabidiol. And again, remember, we're looking at cannabidiol's effects on its own, if it can enhance THC analgesia, and if it can reduce THC's adverse effects, specifically related to abuse liability. I showed you a study earlier that looked at the pro-psychotic-like effects of THC. We are not looking at that here. So this is a study where we looked at 4 dosing conditions. We had people vaporize cannabis using one of these handheld vaporizers. And we looked at THC, 0 milligrams or 25 milligrams, and CBD, 0 milligrams or 25 milligrams. We looked at analgesia, intoxication, and abuse liability. In this study, actually, we gave people the opportunity to self-administer the dose that they had in the morning. Self-administration, those of you who have worked with abused substances in animal models where you have animals lever press for drug. So this is a human proxy of it. Okay, we just give people the drug in the morning. We say, pay attention to how this drug makes you feel, because in the afternoon, you will be able to purchase puffs of this cannabis, 0 to 3 puffs. In this particular study, it was $2 a puff, which is exceedingly expensive. The payment is taken out of their study earnings. So in the afternoon, participants were able to purchase puffs for $2, so up to 4 puffs. Okay, so this particular study is still ongoing. We had 13 participants. They're essentially daily cannabis smokers. And this started right as I was leaving Columbia, right as COVID was hitting. I was at Columbia for 12 years. And so Caroline Arroot, my colleague, was running this grant. I'm very thankful to her. And so this was pain threshold. You could see under placebo conditions that there was no change in pain threshold. With our 25 milligrams of vaporized cannabidiol, we didn't see anything. So we didn't see anything with oral cannabidiol before, nothing with inhaled. With THC, we saw a significant increase in pain threshold. So that's that analgesic response. And you can see that we only saw it with the first time point. So it was a quick onset, short duration of action. Now remember, we thought that cannabidiol might potentiate the analgesic effects here of THC. We did not find that effect here. So we just found that THC and CBD produced increases, but not beyond THC by itself. So the question was, does CBD alone does not reduce pain and does not alter THC's effects. What about intoxication? Again, we thought that maybe CBD might reduce THC intoxication. At least that's a hypothesis. What we found was that CBD actually increased, although not significantly, increased ratings of intoxication relative to placebo. But compared to THC, you can see a clear increase in ratings of intoxication. THC plus CBD looked just like THC by itself. And for abuse liability, very similarly, CBD, we saw some ratings of abuse liability there, but THC was much higher, and THC and CBD produced slightly higher ratings of abuse liability. Then when we asked people to pay, if they wanted to pay for these puffs, now remember, they were going home after the session and able to smoke their own non-government grade cannabis. Everybody talks about how the government grade cannabis is terrible, blah, blah, blah. They were able to go home 2 hours later and smoke their own. We had a number of participants, half the participants, who chose to self-administer at a very high cost, if you calculate how much it costs per milligram THC. We had 6 participants that chose to self-administer our cannabis, and the cannabis type that was self-administered the most was this THC CBD variety. So what we found here was that CBD lacked analgesic effects on its own, did not impact THC analgesia. CBD did not impact THC intoxication and may actually enhance abuse liability. And these were similar to earlier findings with inhaled cannabis that I showed before. And so next we have beta-caryophyllene. And just as a reminder, no studies in humans had been done with beta-caryophyllene. Beta-caryophyllene is one of those terpenes in the cannabis plant. And when you look at animal studies, it suggests that beta-caryophyllene might be helpful for pain with minimal psychoactivity. And also, it could potentially reduce drug reward. So we have this mega study here. It's 15 sessions. And we're looking at beta-caryophyllene as well as myrcene. I'm going to show myrcene in a bit. We have 15 sessions. People have to come in for 15 different sessions. In New York City, I don't think this would have been an issue, but in LA, apparently there's a lot of traffic. People complain about sitting in their cars or taking Uber. So this has been a heroic study, where we're looking at 2 different doses of THC, a low dose and a high dose that is thought to produce enhanced adverse experiences, 2 different doses of beta-caryophyllene, and the combinations of the doses of THC with beta-caryophyllene. You might look at these doses for those pharmacologists in the audience and be like, why is she studying 0.5 and 7.5 milligrams of beta-caryophyllene? These are the most bizarre doses, and they are bizarre, but they're dictated by what is present in the plant. So we chose the lower quartile concentration of beta-caryophyllene that's usually found in the plant, and then usually the upper limit is about 7.5 milligrams of beta-caryophyllene. And so that is what dictated those doses. And we looked at analgesia, intoxication, abuse liability. We used a vaporizer here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the volcano, where the drug is put in that little vestibule. It's not really a vestibule, but the little portal in the middle of the volcano. And then the volcano passes warm air, and the drug is aerosolized and captured in a 1-gallon bag. And the 1-gallon bag has a one-way valve, and participants inhale through that one-way valve bag until the bag is exhausted. So we have completed 12 people thus far. We also are looking at pharmacokinetics, so we have regular blood draws. We have more females than males, which is surprising. And you can see here that these are not totally daily users. They're not our heavy cannabis users, and that was kind of done by design. So here I'm going to focus on the subjective pain responses, in part because they're the most exciting. But what we found here is when we asked people to rate how bothersome the stimulus was, and again, we looked at it as a change of baseline under placebo conditions, we saw that these subjective ratings of bothersome hovered around 0, change from baseline. And when we looked at these crazy doses of beta-caryophyllene, what we found is that there was a slight reduction with the high dose of beta-caryophyllene. And when I show you the effects of beta-caryophyllene with THC, I'm going to really focus on just this high dose of beta-caryophyllene, just for the sake of time. So we saw that beta-caryophyllene reduced subjective ratings of bothersome. THC, as expected, also reduced subjective ratings of bothersome. And what we found, although it's not significant, we are still running participants, what we found is that the addition of beta-caryophyllene and THC further reduced painful ratings of bothersome. With painful, we did not get the same effects. Beta-caryophyllene did not have an effect on subjective ratings of how painful the stimulus was, neither did THC. But when we looked at the two combined, although there's a great deal of variability here, the combination beta-caryophyllene reduced ratings of bothersome compared to placebo and compared to THC by itself. We then looked at this MPQ. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the MPQ. We asked participants to rate the quality of the pain, how punishing the pain was, how the throbbing, sharp, and it's all those questions are added up to a sum. It goes up to 36. And when we looked at ratings of MPQ, we really didn't see much except for a time by dose interaction with beta-caryophyllene, with THC as well, but when we looked at the combination of beta-caryophyllene and THC, we saw a significant reduction in these pain ratings with the combination. So we saw an effect on some subjective pain ratings. So the question was, if we see that, are we going to see effects for other subjective drug effects, such as intoxication and abuse liability? So we first asked people to rate how strong of a drug effect they felt. And we didn't really see anything with beta-caryophyllene, but of course with THC, they rated THC being pretty strong, and beta-caryophyllene did not impact these ratings. What about intoxication? Similarly, with beta-caryophyllene, we did not see any ratings of intoxication. 5 milligrams of THC produces reliable intoxication, and beta-caryophyllene did not alter intoxication. What about abuse liability? So we asked participants to rate how much they liked the drug. Now, this was interesting. Up until now, I really did not think that 7.5 milligrams of beta-caryophyllene was going to do anything. But when you look at ratings of liking, we actually found a significant increase in drug liking for beta-caryophyllene, a terpene that is thought to not have rewarding effects on its own if you look at the preclinical literature, and is thought to reduce the rewarding effects of other drugs. You look at THC, again, similar ratings of liking as you would expect. And strangely, and I'm not quite sure why this is, and we can talk about it, pharmacologists in the audience, when you combined the beta-caryophyllene with the THC, we actually saw a reduction in drug liking. And this was an effect that we saw with some other positive drug effects as well. So to summarize, beta-caryophyllene alone reduced some subjective pain responses, although we're still running participants, we'll see what happens. And it does seem to increase some subjective ratings of analgesic effects associated with THC. Beta-caryophyllene was non-intoxicating and did not impact THC subjective ratings of intoxication. It did elicit some of its own positive subjective drug effects. But it also seemed to reduce THC's abuse-related effects with respect to drug liking. So there is a curious interaction here that we have to probe. One of the ways that we're probing it is we're looking at the pharmacokinetic effects. We're looking at beta-caryophyllene and THC in the blood. We're also running more participants. Next, for myrcene, again, myrcene, similar to beta-caryophyllene, has a strong signal in animal models for pain with minimal psychoactivity. And so we're looking at myrcene here by itself and in combination with THC. And this was an extension of that study I showed you earlier. It's 15 sessions, and 6 of those 15 sessions we're looking at myrcene, 2 different doses, again dictated by how much myrcene is usually present in a cannabis plant, alone and in combination with THC. And if you talk to preclinical researchers in this field, they will tell you that they really see a positive signal with myrcene. So I was really excited here to look at myrcene. But what we found is that although the low dose of myrcene produced reduced ratings of bothersome, the high dose did not. With 5 milligrams of THC, we saw a reduction, and we actually saw with that high dose of myrcene, it increased ratings of bothersome compared to THC by itself. And we saw similar effects for painful. What about subjective drug effects? We looked at ratings of strong. With myrcene, we got a little blip there, so people did report that they felt some drug strength with myrcene. And when we looked at drug strength with THC combined with myrcene, we found increases in drug strength compared to THC by itself. For intoxication, we didn't get a signal with myrcene by itself, but similar to drug strength, we found that myrcene increased intoxication with THC. What about abuse liability? Here, similar to beta-caryophyllene, we found that people reported liking myrcene. Again, a terpene that we usually think of as benign, that's being sold in dispensaries as not really having any kind of clinically significant effect. We still don't know if it has a clinically significant effect, but here we see that it does have some effect. And when we looked at the combination of THC and myrcene, we see that myrcene enhances the abuse liability of THC. Similar effects for good. So myrcene decreases THC analgesia, at least with that higher dose. And while myrcene is not intoxicating, it did elicit positive subjective drug effects indicative of abuse liability. And it also increased THC's subjective drug strength and intoxication, and perhaps the abuse liability of low-dose THC. So to summarize, what we found with these constituents that are popularly thought to reduce or to improve the therapeutic potential of cannabis, what we found, at least with these three, we found that CBD did not impact THC analgesia, and maybe it might actually increase the abuse liability of THC. We found that terpenes, while usually thought of as really not having psychoactive effects, they might actually elicit effects on their own, and they do seem to interact with THC, although we do have to run some more people, so I can get back to you on that once we run the full stats. So to summarize, we talk about cannabis, and I know that some of you who are doing surveys or talking to patients, you might ask them if they use cannabis. But if you think about it, that's a very complicated question. Cannabis has hundreds of constituents, the way that people use them, whether they're being inhaled, whether they're being taken orally, the doses of those individual chemicals in that cannabis plant will undoubtedly play a role in the outcomes that you'll see with your patient population. Cannabis constituents seem to have potential to reduce harms and improve outcomes, but what I've shown you here is that they might actually enhance the negative effects of THC. And that really demonstrates the absolute need for these randomized controlled studies. So collecting survey data, doing qualitative interviews is critical for us to understand what people are using and what their attitudes are towards what they're using. But randomized controlled trials are absolutely imperative for us to understand the safety and the potential therapeutic effectiveness of these different compounds. With the expanding cannabis market, and I'm sure you'll be seeing it here if you haven't already, we're seeing increasing concentrations of THC, other novel cannabinoids, some of which we're studying in the lab, and other terpenes. And so it's going to become more and more important, even though they are a pain in the butt to do these studies. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, they're a huge pain, but they are really important. And so hopefully I've convinced you here the need for these controlled studies, and certainly here in this beautiful facility, 2 facilities, 3 facilities, and your patient population. I know you're already doing this work. This work here is probably more important than ever. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the team, the study participants, and the funding. And I'd be happy to take any questions if I have time. Wow, that was 12:58. That was good timing. Thank you. Or just have a general conversation. Yeah.
So the last set of results you presented were based on the subjective ratings. What about the threshold or the withdrawal?
So we saw the effects with THC, but with the terpenes, we did not see the effects. And the variability was actually quite large, and the timing of the effects. So for example, beta-caryophyllene, we did see that it increased pain threshold and pain tolerance when combined with THC, but it happened at a later time point. It happened like 45 minutes after drug administration when we wouldn't expect to see it. And so I'm waiting to get the bloods back on that. It could be possible that when you combine the two, it might impact the pharmacokinetics. And so I don't know if you remember, but for some of those subjective pain ratings, you saw prolonged reductions in ratings of bothersome and painful when the two were combined. And so it could be that it's impacting the metabolism of THC, so you're having a later onset of effect. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
So things are on the go, right, with the thresholds and stuff like that. What about neuropathic pain, which is spontaneous or generated without any necessary sensory input? Have you looked at any of this type of pain?
We have a study really just looking at smoked cannabis. There's a great deal of interest, especially in people who are using opioids, to be able to determine if cannabinoids might be helpful for both, some subtle opioid withdrawal in people who are using opioids therapeutically, as well as being able to reduce spontaneous pain. So we have a study, it's caught up with the FDA, but it's a really important question to ask. And neuropathic pain, specifically diabetic neuropathy and HIV neuropathy, those are the two neuropathies that have shown the strongest signal for THC specifically to be helpful for, but there's still a lot of questions that are unanswered. And CBD here, there's thoughts that CBD might be specifically helpful for neuropathies, but the studies have not gone through yet. We just finished a study with rheumatoid arthritis and CBD, but we did not see a signal for it. But those are important questions to ask.
There's so many different mechanisms potentially involved in the different types of pain. So, I mean, it could be that a lot of the people that are taking cannabis, smoking, or edibles are doing it because of the different, it works on their pain. And have you looked at the types of pain that the people that are taking it for that? Because that's kind of like screening out the population, right? Those are the ones that get the effect, but what kind of pains do they have?
I'm trying to think about the large survey studies, and now there's enough survey studies that you can find survey studies in people with rheumatoid arthritis or people with other types of musculoskeletal inflammatory pains. And usually the issue is that the surveys, you're capturing people who are using it. So you're capturing the people who are having some success with it. So based off of survey data, I can't remember what types of chronic pain, what types of patients are usually attracted to that. But when you look at the randomized controlled trials, it doesn't seem like cancer pain is all that responsive, at least to the formulations that have been tried. It's really the neuropathic pain, and now there was a recent study that came out with migraine. But I agree, it's not, saying that it helps chronic pain, there's a million different types of chronic pain, 3 different types of chronic pain, but different sources. So it's hard to know specifically, and different formulations. So another issue is that with the surveys, people are asked, are you using cannabis? And then, people answer, yes, they're using cannabis. Maybe they'll be asked, what route of administration are you using? But people aren't really being asked about what type of chemicals in there. And frequently the patient doesn't know. And so we've started having, for our survey studies, we've started requesting that patients take a picture of their product. But even that, for a patient, it ends up being a burden. So it's complicated. So we just published, the National Academy of Sciences, we just published a report just now, a couple months ago. And one of the recommendations that we had was for better surveillance of the types of products that people are using, better labeling so people understand what it is they're using. And that can help for us to understand, what are people using, what are the outcomes. It's really hard to piece together right now.
I have just one other question. That is the FDA going to allow higher concentration cannabis for study? And don't they have a rather low cannabis concentration that they approve for their studies?
So the FDA right now in the United States, if you're getting cannabis from the United States for your studies, even though there are a couple of growers that have a license, as far as I know, all the cannabis is still coming from the farm in Mississippi. And it's the NIDA farm, the NIH farm. The farm in Mississippi has been working very hard to keep up with what's available in the dispensaries, and they're doing a really good job. So they're up to about 20% THC. So it's not 25 or 30% THC, but it's pretty darn high. And the truth is that if you have somebody in your study and they're smoking a gram of that, so we have people smoking 560 milligrams of plant material, that ends up being a lot of THC. What the FDA cares about is they care about safety of the participants, and they want to make sure that the investigator deems that it's safe for participants to leave the lab after using it. But they're very concerned about the quality of the product, making sure there's no mold, pesticides, all that kind of stuff. So the strength of it, if I have a study that got funded by the California State, where I'm comparing those dabs that I showed you, those high potency extracts that are almost like 100 milligrams THC, 100% THC that people are inhaling in one puff. So you can get 100 milligrams of THC in one puff relative to, versus like 10 puffs of like a cannabis joint. So I haven't yet put it through the IND yet, but what I'm going to propose is that I'm only going to be recruiting people who are using those dabs, those extracts, and who are using them heavily. So whatever I'm giving them in the lab is equivalent to or less than what they're exposed to outside. And usually that's what the FDA cares about, is that I'm not introducing any increased harm to them. But it is a big question. The supply that we get is extremely limited. And that's part of the reason why this work is so hard. So even if, when hemp became legal across the United States, everybody thought, oh my gosh, cannabidiol is in hemp. It's going to be so much easier to study cannabidiol because it's not going to be Schedule 1 anymore. My first Schedule 1 license was cannabidiol. Now it's all over the place. But the truth is that you couldn't find a manufacturer that was making the cannabidiol up to FDA standards. So it wasn't that it was illegal. It was that FDA wanted to make sure that it was quality stuff. So the high potency stuff is a really important question. And I think that the FDA, I have a couple of studies that have been approved with like higher potency THC cannabis. But, we'll see what happens with my state-funded study. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Excellent presentation. I just wanted to know if you had any work in Marinol, which is like the medication with marijuana. Have you done it? Have you looked into that?
Yeah, so Marinol is oral THC, but it's synthetic. So Marinol was approved by the FDA in the 1980s. That was the one that I showed earlier. That was approved for improving appetite and reducing nausea in certain patient populations. So the study that I showed early on, where I compared smoked versus oral THC, that was comparing Marinol, so 20 milligrams of Marinol, to 20 milligrams of THC that was administered through smoked cannabis. So Marinol is nice to use because it's Schedule 3. So it's not Schedule 1, so it's not a huge pain in the butt to study. And your pharmacy can order it, all that kind of stuff. So it's a lot easier to work with than, let's say, going out and getting a THC gummy from the cannabis plant. So that's a lot harder to do.
And I have another question. How are the concentration of THC different in the plant? Like how does that alter? I mean, you were showing us a wide range of numbers. How does a farmer increase the THC or?
So yes, so all kinds of the chemical constituents of the cannabis that people are getting, it depends on a lot of different factors. One factor is its genotype, just its genetic makeup. But other important factors are that these chemicals are extremely sensitive to temperature, to oxygen, and to light. So if you go into a grow facility for one of these cannabis manufacturers, you're going to see that they're controlling all of those so tightly in order to make sure that every plant is expressing those cannabinoids at the same level. Otherwise, you could have the same plants from the same seed, and if one is grown in a dark place and one is grown in a very sunny place, they can end up expressing very different levels of cannabinoids. And so that's one factor. Another factor is even after it's harvested, even after the cannabis plant is harvested, it still depends on how much exposure it's getting to light, sun, light, air, and temperature. And so cannabis, the THC in cannabis can degrade, or THCA can degrade very, very quickly and turn into CBN. So like almost a very different type of cannabinoid. So all these factors play a role in the expression profile. But what a lot of manufacturers are doing now, especially with the vape pens, I don't know if vape pens are a big thing here, but with vape pens where the cannabinoids are extracted and put into a cartridge and people are puffing on it, the manufacturer can essentially decide, what are the different types of cannabinoids they can have in it. And then in California, as well as other marketplaces, now when you get, you go to a dispensary and you don't just get flour and like make your own cigarettes or joints, whatever you call it, you get pre-rolls, okay? Now they're selling pre-rolls that have the 30% THC cannabis, but they're also infusing it. They're infusing it with, kief, hash, to increase the amount of THC that's in that cigarette. And so there are all these different ways that it's manipulated. I mean, we've come very far. Those are plant products, but when you go into dispensaries now, especially in California, it's not the marijuana. It's not the same thing anymore. Especially the extracts where you inhale them essentially using like a glass. It's called a rig. It looks like a very different thing. So people always say, what's going to be the next thing? I saw an there's like, rectal administration. I mean, there's administration for, when you think about it, like therapeutically, that's important if people are having issues with emesis, and there's all different types that are coming out. And, again, it's like, what's going to be the next thing? And I think that a lot of these companies are trying to survive, and they're trying to come up with unique ways to get the market and get the consumers. And I think a lot of the companies think that the more THC there is in that product, the more customers want it. Although if you look at surveys also, the customers don't necessarily want to have all their THC in one inhalation. In fact, the cannabis that we use here, it's from the farm in Mississippi. Every time I give a talk to like an international scientific audience, actually US based too, that's not academic, people are like, that question me, like, what kind of cannabis is this? Oh, it's from Mississippi, forget it. Oh, that stuff is crap. Oh, that's terrible. But first of all the studies that have been done with smoked cannabis and pain relief, up until maybe like 5 years ago, they were done in the United States with that same cannabis grown in Mississippi with very low THC. And also, we have our daily cannabis smokers in Los Angeles, and they are choosing to purchase our cannabis in the afternoon, and they've asked us, where do you get that cannabis? Okay, like at the end of the session, at the end when we debrief them, they're like, where do you get that? We're like, call Mahmoud El-Soli in Mississippi. So, it gets a rap, but it's really not bad. Yeah, it does the job. The FDA likes it. That's what's important.
Do you think rescheduling it to a Schedule 3 is going to totally change the research landscape and the work that you're doing?
So one can hope that it will, although I think if it does change to Schedule 3, in my head, I'm thinking the process to change it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 will probably take such a long time that it will probably go off the Controlled Substance Act before that happens. Nobody really knows what it will look like when it becomes Schedule 3. So which plant will be, all the plants in the dispensaries, that is not going to be Schedule 3. It has to be like FDA approved to some degree. And also, like in my cynical head, this work is always one bureaucracy, one piece of red tape after the next, that if it does change to Schedule 3, I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go get my Schedule 3 license. I'm going to have another DEA visit, all that kind of stuff, yeah. So we'll see. I mean, it should, in theory. I think it will just take a long time, yeah. Thank you. This was really great. I appreciate all the questions.